Hello, and welcome to this video which is about Cubase 11 sampler track improvements. Sampler tracks were originally introduced in 2016 with Cubase 9, but now they've been given some extra features, a pair of LFOs, the ability to slice samples, and a smattering of other small improvements. So, let's take a look at it. So here we are in Cubase, we've got two sampler tracks to look at, and as you can see I've named them appropriately. So the first one we're going to look at is LFO. So the sampler tracks now have an LFO. Now if you're not up to speed with sampler tracks, you can check a video which is linked in the description, which is when sampler tracks were originally introduced, which was with Cubase 9, so quite a while ago, and now they've had these updates. So that's what we're looking at here. We're not going to look at the rest of the functions. All I've got set up on this particular track is a Hammond organ sound, which is just loops. This is from the Loop Masters welcome pack, so this is part of the free samples that you get with Loop Masters. If you just sign up for a Loop Masters account, you get a gigabyte or so of samples. This is one of them. Nothing particularly interesting, just pretty plain fare. So let's take a look at the LFOs. So clicking any of these mod buttons takes you to see the LFO. You'll see the appropriate envelopes. You can see we're seeing pitch envelope and filter envelope and mod, but they share these LFOs. These are shared between all of them. There are two LFOs. They're pretty useful. So we've got a few different waveforms. You can see we've got sine, and we can add in some shape. So in the case of the sine, that adds in a higher frequency. So you can see that's becoming a more interesting waveform, and that's quite useful. Triangle, so you can see that becomes effectively a square wave by just limiting that. Sawtooth, which tilts, which is quite nice. A pulse waveform where you can control the duty cycle. We've got ramp, which is like a sawtooth but alters in a different way, which is quite useful. Log, and you get to control the curve, a bit like the curves on automation and MIDI controllers, etc. And then sample and hold, which is in quotes random, and then gets smooth by this control. And the same there, we've got another one there. So you've got different settings for each one. So here you can have this one set to sine and that one set to sample and hold, etc. We've got sync options as well. So I'm going to set this to a pulse and turn it mostly on so you can see what's happening here. So if I turn this off, with retrigger, we've got three options. So either the first note, so if I play a note on the keyboard, you'll see this pulse. And if I hold down a note and play any others, this won't pulse again. So you see it's not changing, it's just cycling normally. Whereas if we do each note, you can see it's restarting each time when I play a new note. So that's useful for setting things like filter envelopes, because sometimes you want them to only be on the first note and the other notes will get the same filter. And other times you want it so each time it happens, that LFO will get re-triggered, etc. So it's, that kind of thing is useful there. We've got the ability to sync it to tempo or to tempo and re-trigger as well. So that's quite useful, but pretty much set that like that, and then it can get re-triggered if you've got re-triggering as well, so it will take its information from the other. Again, useful options here as well, so we can go for more than a quarter note, etc. So we can go up to 64 beats, which is quite useful. So yeah, they've actually covered the things you might want with this, which is a good thing. So these are pretty flexible. You can use the modulation wheel to alter how much effect this has, so you get some performance characteristics in there. So that will control the intensity of it. You can control the phase here. So by controlling this, you can see that the position of the pulse or any other waveform in relation to where the beginning of the waveform is can change, which again can be useful for fine-tuning things. And if you want it to just be open and then suddenly drop off, you can do that kind of thing. And you've also got randomness. So here, each time it gets triggered, it will be in a different place. So there's plenty of options there. Now, you can have the LFO affecting volume, as we'll hear now. So let's just set up number one to be something fairly straightforward. a nice simple sine wave, clocked at about 1 hertz. So if we turn this up here, it's going to go from being just that to, you can hear that cycling every second, and you can see it on the LED in quotes there as well. So these buttons may need a bit of explanation, because I initially thought that these would mean that I'm now controlling how much of LFO1 is affecting this, and then I'm controlling LFO2. But actually, this is just source selection. So you're either having 100% of LFO1 or 100% of LFO2. You can't pick, oh, I'm going to have a bit of one and some of two. So that, unfortunately, isn't as possibly complicated as it might be. So the routing of this is straightforward. You either pick one or the other and you stick with it. So let's turn that back to 0. Pan, pretty obvious. So here we're going with this 68% pulse. So 68% of the time it's on one side and then flicks to the other. Straightforward. And again, useful, but pretty plain fare. Same for the filter. So we've got this ability to control cut-off frequency. So let's set that to number. And if we can get those extra pulses in there. So that works quite nicely. And again, we've got the ability to control pitch. So obviously you can add vibrato. It can get pretty extreme. So let's put that to much less. But that's typically where you'd use the mod wheel to control the intensity, because then you are adding vibrato using that. So that's one of the reasons why that's there. But you're not limited to using that. You can use it for something else. So you can have the mod wheel also changing the volume or changing the pan LFO as well. But yeah, it's easy to get pretty out of control here. So that's probably where the mod wheel control will come into most effect. So that's a look at the LFO section, which have been added to sampler tracks. And now let's take a look at slicing. So here you can see there is a fairly straightforward disco drum loop, which I've used on some other videos for Cubase 11. And slicing is an automated way of slicing, as the name suggests, this sample into multiple different regions, which can then be played via the MIDI keyboard. So rather than just playing the entire sample, as this, we'll be able to play different sections, and it's pretty easy to use. So you just go to slice here. So here you can see I've clicked slice, and then you can adjust the threshold control. So this is probably the most important control here, and alter how many slices we end up with. So you can see if I turn the threshold right up, we're getting one every beat, which could be exactly what you want. If I turn it down, we can end up with one pretty much every 16th, although you can see that the timing of them changes slightly depending on the groove that's happening. So even if I turn this all the way down, some of these are slightly longer than others. But let's go, for the sake of argument, let's go for something like that. So we've got most of these, but not everyone is the same length, just so this is going to be a little easier to see. Now, as you do this, you may have noticed down here that the key mapping has changed. So now this C3, instead of playing the whole sample, will just play just this little slice. Now we're sounding quite retro, aren't we? C sharp will now play the next slice, and so on. D, D sharp, E, F, and so on. So that allows you to play the whole thing. Now you could play the whole thing by forgetting that this one's twice as long, that kind of thing. So I'm doing that manually, but you don't need to do that. Handily, you can just drag this MIDI phrase onto your sampler track. So I'm just going to click and drag that, and there you can see that now has all of the right notes. So if I play this, so you can see that's played all of those slices. And this means that editing this to change the loop now becomes really easy. So let's say I want a double snare at the end. I just need to change the pitch of that last sample to be the snare, which happens before. So I'm just going to double click that, just move that down. We even hear the sample. And now, as we go back to the beginning, just open up the sampler track again. If we play that, we'll get the same loop, but with a double snare at the end. Now, let's say you wanted to add a slice to here. You can hold down the Alt key and then just click. You can also Alt click one again to remove it. If you want to move any slice marker, you can do that by dragging it around as well. So you've got real control over here. Now, bear in mind, this obviously is something which was previously a paid option a long time ago with a program like Recycle, etc. But it's nice to have this ready and integrated into Cubase, so the kind of thing that every project can use, and you can send this to someone else who's got Cubase and they're going to have all of these functions here. They're not going to have to load up a bunch of samples or a Rex file that maybe they don't understand what it is. So it's nice for this to be here. Now, there are a few other things which have been made. So let's just take a quick look. So we've got normalization. So you can just click normalize sample here. Now, this sample has already been normalized, so there's nothing to do, but you can quickly change the gain of a sample by altering that, and you can see that's being reflected there. So if our sample wasn't at normalized already, which most samples are, but not all of them, then you can make use of that. We can also trim samples. So let's say you decided you only wanted the first part of this. So by highlighting that, often if you're working with a large sample, let's say you've got a long bit of dialogue that you've got from a film or whatever, and you only want that small part, it can be a little bit difficult to deal with. So it's much easier if you just highlight what you want, and then you can click this trim sample, and you'll see now our sample only has that there. We can go back to the full one by reverting to full sample here. And then now we can pop that sample end back to where it was, and everything's back exactly as it was before. In the mod envelope here, you can see the waveform of the sample. So whenever you're trying to work with single hits in particular, it's useful to be able to see what the wave is doing in relation to it. So for instance, if you're trying to get your amp envelope timed up really well, you'll be able to use this to see it much more clearly and not just have to guess. Always a useful thing. Another new addition is KeyFollow in the filter section. So here's a new sampler track with a synth sound on, and adding a filter to it and picking cutoff and resonance. So what I've done here, I'll highlight this. You'll see it on screen. So we'll see it in the spectrum analyzer here. It's accentuating this harmonic here, which is an octave above the fundamental. So you can see on the diagram, it's just over 1K. And the problem with that is, without KeyFollow, this doesn't follow it. So if I play a different note, it's still accenting that same frequency. And if I move up to there, then you can see that that's being accented. And on a lower note, we'll get different harmonics accentuated. And it doesn't follow the tone. So the tone doesn't follow with it. And our filter is only really effective in the way we wanted at the original note frequency. So by setting KeyFollow, so here, if we set it to 100%, the frequency will follow the note that's being played. So now the filter's turned up and is moving up to there, and you can see the effect as that goes. So that's what filter KeyFollow does. It allows it to follow the notes that you play, and the filter follows the pitch of the notes that you change. Sometimes you want it to be static, so you can play different notes and then the filter is just accenting different harmonics, but quite often you want it to follow that. You can do that. You can have it follow a different amount so it doesn't go as far, or you can even have it follow in a negative way, so as the pitch goes up. So there you can hear that the filter is now here, and as a result, we're getting this effect where it's really cutting these high notes off completely. So I'm moving up on the keyboard, and the filter you can see is moving down. So that cutoff frequency is moving down. And as we go down, it brightens up. So there's musical uses for that as well, but it's handy to have that and be able to control it. Your envelopes can also be synchronized to the project tempo. So at the moment, the default mode is that they are set in terms of time, but you can set them to be sync. And here you can see that all of this ruler is measured in this case 16ths, because that's what the grid is set to, but you can set it to any musical division you want. And then as you change tempo, these envelopes will change, which again is a useful way for making this automatically follow. So it can be useful for it to follow this. So when you have notes which are played, which let's say they are eighth notes, because of the way you've set up the sampler track, then they will still stay as eighth notes once the tempo changes, which can, again, save a lot of work. Pitch now has octaves in, so you can change this very quickly. So here's the original sound being played at C3. And you can see Pinky and Perky have turned up, or it's turned into a line if we go low. And notice that the waveform changes as we do this. So you can see, if you need to, its effect in terms of the timing of your envelope and so on. Pitch bend range is now available as up to 24 semitones, which again can be useful. Forgive the glitchiness there of my extremely poor controller keyboard. Normally it would be smoother than that when you'd hear that kind of pitch bend, but obviously 24 semitones of pitch bend is going to get pretty glitchy if you've got something which, in the case of my keyboard, only outputs 7-bit rather than 14-bit pitch bend. And we also have a quality setting. So we can have standard and high, best, and extreme, which change the algorithms which are used, which also control how much CPU use is in play, although I've not seen any significant difference with these, but you may find that if you're a little close to the edge, maybe it will give you just a bit of extra. In the vintage mode, we can control bit reduction, so we can make it sound more like kind of things like TAL samplers had built in for a while. So let's just reduce this rate. And here, if we can hear a difference on admittedly a rather poor sample. And when we get down to there, you can hear that aliasing noise. And now we sound like a kind of DX7 keyboard sound with that. Turntable as well, simulation. So yeah, a bit of vintage joy to play around with, that kind of thing. Sampler tracks also allow you to import Rex V1 and V2 files. So for instance, if you got these from Recycle, etc., then you can load these directly in. So we'll add a new sampler track. You may need to change the file type, but here on the Mac we don't. So let's just load that up, and you can see that's imported that, and that's ready to play. It's got all of those samples in there, and they are all ready to go, and we can just drag this in, and that will play exactly as we'd expect with anything we'd sliced ourselves. So there's a link to where I got that file from in the description. Another nice small touch is that we can lock all of the parameter settings for a given sample. So in this case, I'm going to lock that. And if I load up a new sample, all of these other settings will be retained. So we'll only change the sample, which is useful. So I'm going to change that Hammond to a Rhodes. To load that up, everything else has stayed the same. So you can see that all of the settings are exactly as they were before. And now we've got just that Rhodes with all of those settings rather than it starting from scratch as it used to do. So hopefully you now have a better idea of what sampler tracks have to offer you in the Cubase 11 family. If you found this video useful, please consider liking and subscribing for more music tech tuition.